Hello, and welcome to Woodworking in Progress. In this video, I'll be talking about how I made this project, a TV stand. Now what's interesting is this is for a client for whom I previously made two other projects, a coffee table and an end table. So my goal was to make this match the look and feel of those other projects. So the same wood and color, and also the same woodworking details, the knobs, the grooves, how the feet are cut. This is a pretty big project, not just because it's 6 feet wide, but also in terms of the number of steps. So I'll be breaking it down into parts. I'll start with the frame, then the inside, the top, and finally the drawers. But before we get to all that, we have to talk about how to process rough lumber. The first thing I need to do with my rough lumber is to plane it to a consistent thickness. Now the challenge with the lumber is that it's not necessarily even along the face. So I got these high spots here, for example. If I put it through the planer, I just get a thinner, uneven board. So what I do is I get a perfectly straight and sled. I put my lumber on top, and as it goes through, the planer is going to knock off these high points here. Right? All I have to do is to make sure the wood doesn't wobble, because remember, it's not very even. So wherever there's a low point here, I'll just put a little shim or a wedge to keep it from rocking. And once I get a nice straight, even cut along the top, then I'm done. So here's my sled. You can see the gray tape that's holding down the wedges, and these are underneath the lumber to keep it nice and level. That way, during one of its many passes through the planer, it stays straight and I can get the top all leveled off. You can see I check it every few passes to see whether it's done. Now that I have all the pieces planed and a consistent thickness, I need now to get a straight edge along one of the sides of the board. The boards that I have, they don't have a straight edge. Right? If I put, for example, my level against it, you can see there's a huge gap. Right? That's not going to allow me to cut the pieces to width later. So I need to get that straight edge. What I have done with other projects is I've used my sled, and I can use that on the table saw and I get a nice straight edge. The problem for this project is my boards are too long. They're close to 6 feet long. So my sled won't work. I don't have enough space at the back of my table saw, and it's just not safe to do it that way. So I've had to come up with another way to try to get a nice straight edge. What I'm going to do is use the plywood that I bought for the project as a reference surface to create the straight edge in my lumber. I use a special router bit. You can see it's got a ball bearing that'll trace against the plywood, and then the cutter above it will copy that straight edge into my lumber. All I have to do is take my router, run it across, and cut a nice edge. Well, it's always good to have a plan B. So I routed a couple of the pieces for the stand top, and then I put them against each other. So it didn't look so good. You can see here, there's a pretty big gap right in the middle, like it's about a 1/16 of an inch. Now what it means is that my plywood edge, which I assumed it would be perfectly straight, well, it wasn't. It was off by, well, a 32nd of an inch, which is not much for one piece, but when I'm putting two pieces together, it's doubled. So had to try something else. What I did was I took a piece of white melamine, checked that it was straight. I actually ran it through the table saw twice to make sure it was a nice straight edge. I then used that to correct my plywood edge. What I did was I clamped it to my plywood. I then routed it smooth, just like I was doing before. This time I used the white melamine as my reference surface for the ball bearing, and I cut the plywood. Of course, the melamine wasn't 6 feet long, so I had to do it in 2 passes. I had to carefully position my level as another straight edge that the melamine could use. This is getting complicated. But Anyway, I managed to trim the plywood. I recut those pieces, checked before I went any further, and mercifully, they're okay. I'm quite happy with how that's going to look. So that's great because I'm not sure what I would have done for Plan C. With the wood all squared away, I start by cutting the pieces I need for the end panels. And this jig I'm going to use to cut the bottoms of the legs to have a nice little angle on them. So I set up the angle I want, where I want the cut to start, and then I just clamp the leg in place, run it through the saw, and with repeating it, I get all 4 legs looking exactly the same. After staining the pieces, I can put them together using some dowels and some glue, clamp them up, and now I'm ready for the next step. The next step is with the stringers. Those are the 5.5 feet long pieces that join the ends. To match the previous designs, I need to put 2 grooves parallel almost the whole length of them. On the other tables, I used my large router with rather complicated jig to make the grooves. This time, I want to try and keep it a little simpler. I now have this, which is called a palm router. A lot lighter, smaller, and it has this, an edge guide. So what I'm going to do is I'll set it up. I can route the groove along one edge, just spin it, and then route on the second side. I should get 2 parallel grooves. I've already done a test here. Very happy with that on just a piece of scrap. So now, let's do it for real. Well, that didn't go as planned. Things started out okay, but didn't continue. You can see in this picture that the groove, well, wasn't really straight. Kind of more of a curve, you know, a theoretical straight line. The problem is this edge guide that I was so happy about. So it's supposed to be here and, you know, continue a nice straight line. Problem, see how easy I did that? This is tight. Well, not so much. So fairly disappointed with this. Fortunately, I'll be able to flip the piece over and route the other side, because the bad side will be hidden, which is great. And I kind of knew I'd had a couple shots at it. But now it's on to the ever popular Plan B. In the end, I used a piece of scrap, clamped it as a fence, and ran the router. And that seemed to work okay. And then just touched them up with a little bit of sanding. To put the panels together with the stringers, I needed dowels, glue, and some assistance. Now I couldn't clamp anything here, so what I used was pocket hole screws on the back side of each of the stringers. And the green tape, that was there in case there was any glue squeeze out, so it would go on the tape and not the nice finish. Now I moved on to the shelves and dividers. So here I'm routing a dado in the lower shelf to support the dividers. Now my router bit wasn't wide enough to do it in one pass, so I had to take 3 tries at it. Then I checked it with a piece of scrap plywood here, and everything looked good. Lastly, I attached some cleats to the frame to support the shelf from underneath.
Sometimes it's hard to see the fine details from a design that I've done just on a piece of paper. So this is one of those times. With the TV stand, I've got drawers on the end and a single shelf in the center. And the problem is the thickness. The shelf is going to be 3/4 thick, whereas the gap between the drawers is going to be like this. So it's hard to get a perfect symmetry, right? To get a nice even line all the way across. So I was trying to figure out, well, where should I put this shelf relative to the gap in the drawers? And it's really hard to see that on, well, a piece of paper. So I did up a little model. So after some calculations, I cut these pieces to be the size of the drawer faces that I'm planning, taped them into place, took a piece of shelf, And now I can just move this up and down, maybe take a picture or two, and go, oh, okay, you know what? That looks about the best. So, despite a lovely design and plan, sometimes you just have to see things full scale.
Now I don't want the front edge of the shelves and the dividers to show because they're just plywood edges. So I'm applying this tape. It comes in a variety of wood types. This one's oak. And you simply cut it, iron it on, which melts the adhesive, and that's all done. The last step is simply to trim it flush. And I have this handy little cutter, a few passes each direction, and it's all set. All that's left is to sand and then apply a finish, and they're ready to install. So now I'm ready to actually install the shelves and the dividers. So first I'm just applying some tape to prevent squeeze out, and then glue, and then dropping in the lower shelf. And that just sits on the cleats that I installed earlier. You can see I've got tape there as well to prevent glue squeeze out from the dividers. Once I've got those all clamped, I put some screws from underneath to keep that shelf installed. I'm also, you can see on the clamps, I've got pieces of paper to prevent marring the finish. Now I'm working on the dividers. They're a little tricky to install because they have to be notched at the back, and it's kind of a custom fit. But eventually I got those done, and then you can see for the final piece for the upper shelf, again I've got the tape to prevent squeeze out, and eventually everything goes in nicely. Now I'm moving on to the top pieces. This is the support frame. Reinforced the corners with pocket hole screws, and I've made a little notch at the back where cords can kind of be wrangled to keep them out of the way. I also routed the front edges using a cove bit. Now I have the pieces for the top itself, and I'm marking the location for the biscuit slots. To put them in there, I just use my handy biscuit joiner, run it up against all of the marks, and instant biscuit slots. Now the pieces will be aligned, and I'll get a nice flat top. You can see here along the top, the before picture, before biscuits, one of them was quite bent. And the bottom, nice and flat. After I glue up the pieces with the biscuits, I've got a nice flat surface, but I need to trim the ends to make them nice and even. Then I can move on to working the ends. Mainly, I want to make a nice round over here. So I'm taking my router, do a couple passes, and here's before I started, and then after. A nice bullnose effect. Now here I'm drilling mounting holes in the underside of the top very carefully. To make sure that I don't go through, I use a little trick to set the depth of the drill. Then the ever exciting sanding phase, and the top will be ready for a finish. Now I move on to the drawers. The first step is to actually install the drawer slider. Now it has to be correctly positioned, both from the front, so I clamped a piece of plywood there for the depth, and up from the shelf using a spacer and my handy drill. I then clamp the slider in place, and I mark the location for the mounting holes. I then drill them out and attach the slider with a few screws. Once that's done, I can install the drawer side part of the slider and move on to actually making the drawers. So now I'm actually ready to make the drawers. First, I cut all the pieces I need, label them, route rabbets in the bottom to make assembly that much easier, and for dividers in the drawer, I size them using a DVD, which is actually going to be stored there. So once I've marked the actual size of it, I take it to the router and put all the sides through. Then it's on to assembly. Apply glue to all the pieces and clamp them together. And I do this using a couple 4-corner clamps, which are really effective for this type of thing. To install the drawers, first I extend the drawer side pieces of the sliders. Then I position the drawer right between them. All that's needed is to put a series of screws through the brackets into the side of the drawers. Now what makes this easy are these blue plastic drawer support brackets. So they help me position the drawer correctly and hold everything in the right position. After that, I just got to give it a little test close, take the brackets away, and that's done. On to the next one. And fast forward to all 4 of the drawer fronts being cut, installed, and the knobs attached. All that's left now is to apply finish. First the stain and then a couple coats of poly. Here I'm using my handy dandy rotating finishing table to make that job just a little bit easier. Then it's on to the top itself, which I have to do outside because it's, well, fairly large. But it's starting to look pretty good. And one of the final steps is to attach the 3 back pieces. And I do that using my nail gun. Nice and easy.
And so, project is now done. It's been quite a lot of work, but I think it turned out pretty well. Pretty happy with how things are looking. The grooves, I mean, it took some work, but I think they look pretty nice. The drawers, they slide nice and easily, which is always a plus in a drawer. And they'll also hold a lot of things, DVDs, CDs, whatever. The center section, we have a nice shelf. The back with the openings for the cords, that's all looking good. And even around the back, we've got a little kind of notch area in the top, so the cords can kind of get, wrangled there. And there's a little shelf for a power bar to install there. And the top turned out actually really well. I'm really pleased with it. It looks great, and it's nice and flat. So pretty happy with how everything turned out. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please give it a like, and we'll see you next time for more Woodworking in Progress.